Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. I'm here in a committee room in Portcullis House with a small number of staff needed to facilitate the meeting, suitably socially distanced from each other. And our witnesses are also here and in their office. Our witnesses are in fact down the line at the Cabinet Office, forgive me, and colleagues are in their homes and offices across the UK. Our witnesses today are Michael Gove, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, and Mark Sweeney, Director General at the Cabinet Office. Mr Gove, good afternoon. Could I ask what role the Cabinet Office plays in bringing together COVID data sources together for the purposes of decision making?
Well, thank you very much, William. The Cabinet Office plays a coordinating role, as you know, in a range of areas across government. We have a COVID task force. That task force ensures both that when the COVID-O, the Operations Subcommittee of the Cabinet that deals with COVID-related decision-making meets, that the appropriate data is provided for that decision-making body. And it is also the case that talented Cabinet Office civil servants help to compile the dashboard that provides people with a daily update on the progress of our fight against the disease.
Thank you. And we're grateful as a committee for your reply, which we received today to the letter from the 27th of November, asking a variety of questions. So just fleshing some of those matters out further. Witnesses to our inquiry on COVID data have told us that the data is fragmented and there isn't an integrated COVID surveillance system. Is that a fair criticism?
I don't think it is. I think that the Joint Biosecurity Centre, another innovation in the government's response to COVID, provides a way of looking at different sets of data that allow us to make appropriate decisions about how to respond. But it's also the case that the public data about the instance of the virus and indeed more broadly about how the NHS is responding is there to enable people, most of course, importantly, parliamentarians, to challenge the government on its decision making.
Thank you. And just in terms of that, overcoming the fragmentation, you mentioned the role that Cabinet Office has in doing that. Is it not easier, rather than overcoming that fragmentation, to try and draw it together to a much more central source?
Well, again, there are different ways of judging how effectively this government or any government is responding to the pandemic. One of the most useful ways, of course, of looking at what's happening is looking by lower tier local authority at the incidence of the virus. So anyone can look up to see whether it's in Manchester or in Surrey Heath. Exactly what the current instance is, and that of course informs all sorts of judgments made not just by the NHS locally, but also of course by government when it comes to questions about tiers and restrictions. But it's also the case that data is published by the ONS, data is published by the NHS, and at different times people will see patterns in that data, signals amidst the broader noise, which will enable them to make judgments about whether or not the right response is being delivered. And
indeed, on the issue of tiering, clearly there's a national command structure and decisions are ultimately made by the Prime Minister. Is this decision-making disconnected from the data? Indeed, is there some subjectivity in how tiering decisions are made?
I think it's the case that there is always an exercise of discretion, but the decision-making is driven by the data. So we look at the instance of the virus, we also look at the pressure on the NHS, and we make a judgment about how effective tiering mechanisms have been. A similar, though not identical, process is carried out, of course, by leaders in the devolved administrations. So the First Minister of Scotland will make a judgment about whether or not, for example, Edinburgh should be in an appropriate tier, looking both at the rate of the virus, the rate of incidence of the virus, potential doubling times if the R rate is above 1, and also the NHS's broader resilience.
And so ultimately, who can the public hold to account for those tiering decisions and the use of data to justify them?
I think the public can always hold the government to account and can challenge. And one of the areas, again, I know that was an area of contention and concern was a decision to put all of Kent into Tier 3. But we've seen the instance of the virus in Kent, particularly but not exclusively in North Kent, also put pressure on NHS capacity elsewhere in Kent. And again, we'll have an opportunity next week to review the existing tiers in which different parts of the country sit. But there is, and I think there was in Parliament, a well-informed and thoughtful debate about where the government had drawn the line.
And in those tiering review decisions next week, will local authorities be dealt with individually or indeed as wider counties or combined authorities? Is there a chance of decoupling, so to speak?
Yes, and I think the point was well made in another select committee hearing by in which the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor were giving evidence, that it can cut both ways. So it might well be the case that one could argue that a certain part of a certain county, whether that was South Kent or South Lincolnshire, should be exempt from the restrictions placed elsewhere on the county. But it might also be the case that, for example, one might want to see Greater Manchester move in its entirety out of its current tier. But it might well be the case that if one were to split up combined authority areas in that way, that some parts of Greater Manchester might stay in a higher tier as well. So, there are arguments, perfectly legitimate arguments either way. One of the points that had been made consistently was that sometimes when you had a part of a broader urban area that was in a lower tier, it wasn't long before, just in the nature of social and other contact, that urban area was prone to an increase in infection because of its proximity to other areas within a broader combined authority area. There are always fine judgments, and the government is always happy to defend where those judgments lie. I naturally have sympathy with those who would argue that they sit within a larger geographical area, but the incidence of the virus is low in that area. But as I say, these are always fine, balanced judgments.
Well, I know that there are two members of the committee, myself being one of them, who will look with interest in the Greater Manchester context and particularly Stockport. And on that note, I go to my colleague and constituency neighbour, Navenda Mishra, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gove, in July, the Prime Minister announced that the responsibility for data was moving into the Cabinet Office. Could you please update us on the progress of that move, and specifically which elements of the government data are now within the remit of your office, the Cabinet Office?
Yes, DCMS, of course, leads on data policy overall. So if we're thinking about how we can make sure, that's a cliche to say that data is the new oil, but if we think about how the broader economy and society can make the most of steps forward in the use of data, that's a DCMS lead. But when it comes to how government itself uses data, that is something which the Cabinet Office leads on. We've benefited from the support of Doug Gove of Amazon in reviewing how we operate, and we're looking at how we can improve the way in which the Government Digital Service and others use data analytics to improve decision making and also to improve transparency.
Thank you. And this recent change, how has this change impacted the data-led response to the current pandemic?
Well, again, I think that it's helped in that there's a clear understanding that the Cabinet Office has a role in making sure that we can cross-reference data from different sources, from the NHS, from DHSC and others, in order to try to provide as comprehensive a picture as possible about how government is responding to the disease, but also how other partners, including local government, can play a role as well.
Thank you. Just a supplementary on that, Chair, if that's
yes,
okay.
Yes, of course.
There are reports. Thank you. There are reports in the media that there now exists a secret clearinghouse within the Cabinet Office, screening responses and logging, retaining and sharing information on those making freedom of information requests. So my question is, 2 points on the question. Is there any substance to these reports? But also, has the Cabinet Office changed protocols across government in relation to release of data following these FOI requests, including from members of the press community?
Well, as a former journalist myself, I recognise the importance of a fair and consistent approach towards freedom of information requests, and that's exactly what we have. There's been some highly coloured reporting of this, but the truth is that the Cabinet Office does have a role in making sure that we apply consistency in our response to freedom of information requests. But the idea that there is a secret clearinghouse or any sort of blacklist is, I'm afraid, not, well, actually, I'm glad it's not correct. And it is the case that when we look at all freedom of information requests, they're applicant blind. So whether or not it's a freelance journalist, someone working for an established title, or a concerned citizen, all freedom of information requests are treated in exactly the same way.
So the suggestion that the government's been acting unlawfully when it comes to freedom of information requests or other data sharing activities, would that be a fair comment, or would that be not correct?
There is no evidence that has come to light or come to my attention of any unlawful activity. If people do have specific concerns, then I'm always happy to address them.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Rachel Hopkins, please. So I beg your pardon, Ronnie. Ronnie Cowan is coming in. Forgive me, Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's actually a supplementary to the supplementary there, because there's been, when I read this, that the Cabinet Office was taking control of the data, and therefore it raised my concern, because the Cabinet Office has not got a great history of handling FOIs very wisely. And we're going back to, I think the best example I can think of is the infected blood inquiry, where NHS patients were infected with HIV. And Jason Evans' father died as a result of this. He put an FOI into the Treasury. The Treasury were happy to answer it, but it got passed into, you don't want to call it a clearinghouse, but it got passed into the Cabinet Office. There was a 5-month delay before he got his answer. So if you don't want to call it a clearinghouse, there's something happening in the Cabinet Office where decisions are being made about whether or not FOIs have been answered and how promptly they've been answered. Is that going to be a situation through COVID-19 inquiries as well?
No.
So why was that a problem with the infected bloods?
Well, again, the point I made earlier is that the Cabinet Office is there to ensure a consistency in the treatment of freedom of information applications, but these decisions don't go anywhere near ministers.
So who's making the decision as to whether or not an FOI gets answered?
It is the case that obviously there are different officials in different government departments that receive freedom of information requests, and then the Cabinet Office is responsible for making sure that there is a consistent response.
So why is the Treasury not answering its own FOIs?
Well, the Treasury will have access to information about its operation, as all government departments will, but we simply ensure that there is a consistent approach across government.
So you dispute the fact that the Cabinet Office Clearinghouse have actively discouraged the release of sensitive information?
I think the Cabinet Office and all government departments will want to make sure that in answering freedom of information requests, we provide the maximum amount of transparency. But of course, sometimes, as in responding to all freedom of information requests, we have to have appropriate consideration to any issues of confidentiality that might arise.
So can you assure me going forward that if FOIs are raised around all the working practices associated with COVID-19, those FOIs will be responded to as accurately and as promptly as possible?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rachel Hopkins, please.
The usual procedures around procurement were relaxed to manage the COVID-19 response. What steps were taken to manage the risk of doing this?
You're absolutely right. We used well-established procedures which exist in any emergency situation in order to be able to procure, for example, PPE at speed. Regulation 32.2.c of the Public Contracts Regulations, which of course predates the pandemic, explicitly allows for emergency procedures, including direct award. But of course, what we always seek to do is to make sure that even though we can accelerate the acquisition of the products that we need in an emergency to keep people safe, we do so in a way that's consistent with good procurement practice.
Just following on from that then, there was, example of where someone was awarded Clandboy over about £108 million worth of contract was given to this confectionery wholesaler 2 months before they received a risk rating of red. That's not really acceptable, is it?
Well, we'll look at each individual case, but I think it's important to recognise that of the PPE that was procured, during the pandemic and procured at speed, 99.5% of it was absolutely, what was required, and it was all procured, as I say, in a way which ensured that at no stage did anyone on the NHS front line, even though times were very, very difficult, at no point were we in a situation where we ran out of PPE.
But it's true to say that there was a situation where some PPE just wasn't fit for purpose. For example, pest fix, 25 million FFP2 masks, total of £59 million. We don't know whether they can be used. So I think there are questions around this, but I'll move on to my next one around the procurement of PPE. There is the establishment of the high priority lane to process offers of PPE from firms with contacts in government or parliament. But how were conflicts of interest managed?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that no matter where any request or offer of support came from, every offer of PPE went through the same 8-step technical and commercial assurance process, including quality checks, price controls, and other due diligence. And of course, I think it's fair to say that many of the requests for close attention to offers of support came from members of Parliament across the political spectrum, and indeed my own opposite number, Rachel Reeves, wrote me a helpful letter in which she outlined some companies that she felt were experiencing frustration and not having their kind offers of support looked at sufficiently quickly. And we did look quickly at Rachel's request, and while there were a number of firms that were capable of providing support, there were also one or two whose experience or capacity to provide the support required was perhaps not all that it might be.
I appreciate your frankness there, and I hope you will have feedback from the Minister who spoke at the Westminster Hall debate earlier this week, to also hear from members such as the member for Hull and Hessel, Emma Hardy, who also was just flabbergasted why one of the most long-standing producers of PPE just wasn't taken up to produce PPE, and yet others, such as a couple I've mentioned, were with no history. I still think, what are the safeguards now in any further procurement, because there really are some questions around the whole process.
Yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Westminster Hall debate that occurred yesterday, because I think the Cabinet Office Minister who responded, Parliamentary Under Secretary Julia Lopez, responded with great authority on this question and put to bed a number of the concerns. I can understand why these concerns have been raised that people had made, but which were fundamentally misplaced. The high priority lane received 493 offers, but only 47 of those were taken forward. So 90% were rejected. And it is the case that there were a number of companies, some with a high public profile, that had their offers rejected. The government can't go into the details of why they were rejected, because of course, the commercial confidence of those negotiations has to be respected. But it's also the case that there were some companies which didn't have a prior strong track record in certain areas, who had the connections with those who were supplying in other countries or the lines of credit that enabled them to be nimble and effective procurers of the goods that we needed. But we're very, very happy to have every...
Mark Sawyer and Ralph Tripp and Melinda Wharton. Based on today's agenda and all financial interests reported by committee members and consultants, there has been only one conflict of interest waiver issued under 18 U.S. Code 208 in connection with this meeting. Among these consultants, Dr. James Hildreth, a special government employee, has been issued a waiver for his participation in today's meeting. The waiver was already posted on FDA website for public disclosure. Dr. Paula Annunziato is currently serving as the industry representative to this committee. Dr. Annunziato is employed by Merck. Industry representatives are not appointed as special government employees and serve as non-voting members of the committee. Industry representative on this committee is not screened for their financial interests. Industry representatives act on behalf of all regulated industry and bring general industry perspective to the committee. Mr. Sheldon.
That there are many Labour MPs who will, and indeed Liberal Democrat or Scottish National or others, who will have good businesses in their constituency, and it is a absolute right of members of Parliament to stand up for businesses in their constituency and to make sure that ministers buck their act up. And the whole point about the approach that we were taking was to make sure that offers of PPE could be followed up as rapidly as possible. And as I mentioned, my opposite number wrote me a helpful letter setting out some companies that she felt it was an absolute priority for us to look at. And as I pointed out, one or two of those companies were not best placed to help us, but the letter was nevertheless an honest and sincere effort to help us in a national crisis.
Tom Randall, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Gove, an independent review of Cabinet Office Communication Services contracts is underway. Could you tell me why this has been deemed necessary?
Sorry, Tom, I missed the first part of your question. A major review of...
I'm so sorry. An independent review of Cabinet Office Communication Services contracts is underway. Could you tell me why this has been deemed necessary?
Well, if you're referring to the particular challenges that we faced during the course of the pandemic, I think it is the case that we asked the non-executive director of another government department to look at that in order to provide assurance, and that report, the Boardman report, is now published, so parliamentary colleagues and others can look at the recommendations that were made. And it reflects, I think, on the point that Rachel made. We were operating at speed. We operated in a way which I believe was rigorous, but there is always, always, always room for improvement.
Thank you. And just moving on to, apologies. Looking on to sort of a broader question of sort of proprietary and ethics. Are codes of conduct binding on the conduct of those to whom they apply?
It depends on who is the eventual arbiter, but codes of conduct are there to guide how civil servants, special advisors, and in the case of the Ministerial Code, ministers should operate. In the case of the Ministerial Code, of course, it's the Prime Minister who is the ultimate arbiter. But the Ministerial Code and the other codes of conduct are there in order to ensure that that everyone who works in government operates in an appropriate way.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
So, just before I go back to my colleague Navindru, that doesn't seem that they're worth the paper they're written on then, if it depends on who arbitrates in making a judgment, though?
Well, ultimately, there has to be an arbiter. And the Prime Minister is responsible for the composition of the government. He makes recommendations, obviously, to the Queen about those who should be in Her Majesty's government. And that is a well-understood constitutional principle. And the Ministerial Code is there in order to guide ministers to show what is and is not appropriate conduct. But ultimately, there has to be an arbiter, and that arbiter should be someone who is democratically accountable, as the Prime Minister is.
Thank you for that. Navindra Mishra, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gove, would you expect a civil servant who was found to have broken the Civil Service Code of Conduct, would you expect this person to be sacked?
It all depends on the specific circumstances. So again, one of the things about the administration of justice or the policing of any code is that we need to look at the individual circumstances, and obviously the appropriate process of investigation and then judgment would be one that I would hope would be both rigorous about the facts, but also, I think, wise and judicious in any decision about what consequences might follow.
So what about charges of harassment or bullying? What would that entail? Would you expect someone to be found guilty of that, a civil servant? Would you expect them to be sacked?
I think a proper investigation. I think it's always difficult to look at any case in the abstract, and I think it's vital that the facts are assembled, vital that an investigation is rigorous, but also important that at the end of that investigation we look at the conduct of any individual. And again, it's impossible without looking at the specifics of any case to know what the appropriate response might be.
Now, I take your point, but if a full, fair and transparent investigation has taken place and a civil servant has been found guilty of harassment and or bullying, sorry to push on this, but would you expect that to be sanctioned?
Well, again, I think it's impossible without knowing precisely what the individual had done. And we take harassment and bullying incredibly seriously. And it's important that everyone in government should behave with respect to all of their colleagues. But I would always want to see the specifics of any case. When I was a young reporter, I was always told that you could only ever judge whether or not a judgment in court was right if you'd sat through all the evidence and you had an opportunity to see how the judge made or the jury made their decision. So I think it's important in this case to recognise that we need to be in possession of all of the information in any individual case. General rules are very helpful as a guide to conduct, but the specifics of any case matter hugely.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. My final question is, could you tell the committee about steps that are being taken to monitor the number of grievances brought forward by civil servants following allegations, such allegations as bullying, harassment, both within the Cabinet Office itself, but also broadly across the different various government departments, please?
Yes, and it's vital that we do so. I know that friends and colleagues in the trade union movement, Mark Sawatka and others, are anxious to ensure that we in the Cabinet Office and in other government departments take any instance of the poor treatment of our colleagues seriously, and I certainly do. I think it is absolutely vital that government is an exemplar when it comes to making sure that people who are living with disabilities, people who have protected characteristics under the Equalities Act have their rights protected, and more broadly, that everyone who works for government, who's made a commitment to public service, is treated with respect. I think that should be unambiguous and total.
I appreciate that, Mr. Gove, but you haven't addressed the point about tangible steps being taken to monitor these allegations brought forward by civil servants within your department, the Cabinet Office, and more broadly, the various government departments.
Well, I know that you had my colleague Alex Chisholm, the Permanent Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service, in front of you. Alex, along with other Permanent Secretaries, leads work in order to ensure that we monitor how staff are treated. There are regular surveys, generally, of course, of how the civil service feels about the working environment in which individuals operate. But it is also the case that if there are any specific concerns, then they are investigated, they are monitored, and if sufficiently serious, then appropriate action is taken.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gove. Thank you, Chair.
Karen, please.
Yeah, Mr. Gove, there's a range of sanctions available for breaches of MP's code of conduct. Lord Evans, the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, told this committee recently that he thought that a range of sanctions should also be available for breaches of ministerial code. Do you agree, or is it resignation or dismissal?
I think that's a matter for the Prime Minister.
Why? Enlighten me.
Because he's the man who's, or woman, who's in charge of the ministerial code.
I think you'll find he's a man.
Well, we're fortunate in that the Conservative Party have had 2 female prime ministers. But the point I would make, the serious point I would make, is that it's for the Prime Minister to decide on the ministerial code.
Entirely his judgment.
That's my view, yes.
Does that not leave it open to, I'm not nothing personal here, but does that not leave that open to abuse of one person who's got entire control over the ministerial code?
No, I think that the Prime Minister is democratically accountable. I'm a great believer in democratic accountability, and I think that while it's always helpful to have boards or committees which can provide advice, and always very helpful to have people of independence who can conduct investigations. Ultimately, these decisions in our constitution should be taken by people who are democratically accountable.
Okay, but
the judge and jury on whether or not this is the right decision should be the electorate.
Okay, but go back to the question then. To say there's only sanctions that can be taken under ministerial code is if someone's dismissed or resigned. You've not got any opinion on that?
I think it's the Prime Minister. It should be the Prime Minister's decision.
I'm asking your opinion.
That is my opinion. I think the Prime Minister should decide.
Well, if and I'm sure it's not in too far into the future, you become Prime Minister, would you still stand by that?
Mercifully, there's a zero chance of that happening.
I'd like to agree.
I think we could probably both agree that's a good thing, Ronnie.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. Try again. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Sir Alex Allen, as you know, has resigned as the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial standards. Has the process for recruiting his successor been opened yet?
No, Mark, has it been opened?
I believe it is underway, yes.
Yes.
And is it an open competition?
I believe so. I think it will be a process that will be overseen by the Civil Service Commission.
Well, it's not within the code for public appointments, so I think it's a personal appointment of the Prime Minister.
Oh, forgive me. Personal appointment of the Prime Minister.
So it isn't within the code for public appointments?
That's right.
Has that always been the case?
Yes, it has.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think, David, we'll stick with you for a further question, I believe. We're jumping ahead slightly onto the public value framework, if we may, David Jones.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Chairman. The recent spending review has seen departments reporting against the Treasury's public value framework. How does this impact on the system of single departmental plans?
Well, the single departmental plans, which were a feature of the coalition government, are evolving. One of the things we want to do is to make sure that government departments are clear about what their priorities are, and that we also publish metrics so that people can see their performance against those priorities. Single departmental plans have been a very useful tool, but I think it's also right that we should know what the clear top priorities of every government department are, so that we can ensure that there is focus, particularly on delivering the manifesto pledges that the government has.
Forgive me, the public value framework establishes targets for individual departments, whereas the single departmental framework, single departmental plans sets out goals. In the case of the Cabinet Office, they are similar, but they are slightly different too. Is that the cause of any confusion in any way?
It's a refinement, and I think it's important that, for example, one of the things that has changed over time is that the Cabinet Office has assumed additional responsibilities during the course of the COVID crisis, and I think it's important that we should be held to account for those. And also the Cabinet Office has some additional responsibilities that relate to making sure that our relationship with the devolved administrations works well, and I think it's only right that that should be reflected appropriately too.
Are there any processes in place to ensure consistency between the single departmental plans on the one hand and the public value framework on the other?
Yes, there is work between the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, and we have a joint Cabinet Office Treasury Minister, Lord Agnew. So working with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Lord Agnew, and indeed at an official level, Alex Chisholm, the Permanent Secretary, Tom Scholar, the Permanent Secretary in the Treasury, and of course the number 10 team work to agree what the priority should be and what appropriate metrics might be.
So does that obviate any suggestion that there might be confused priorities?
Well, there's always a risk that if you have a set of priorities, that you require additional political leadership in order to make it clear what at any given time is the top priority and what are other areas of very important focus, and then those issues which, while important, are lower priority. And the whole aim of the approach from the spending review is to focus attention on those things which are truly top priority in the context, in particular, of delivering on manifesto promises.
Thank you. I was just about to ask you a question I was keen to ask about churn in departments, but sadly I have to go and vote. So perhaps David Mundell could ask question 14, and I shall be back.
Thank you, David.
Yes, I will, Michael. I will assume this virtual acting chairmanship momentarily. And what Mr. Jones was going to ask you was that you previously had highlighted to the committee the problem of churn in the civil service. How worried are you that the pay freeze announced in the spending review will exacerbate the problem, and what steps are you taking to mitigate this?
I don't think that the pay freeze per se exacerbates the problem. I think it has to be looked at in the broader context, as we know, of the very difficult economic times through which we're living, and in particular the challenges that so many in the private sector face as well. So if one's looking at it purely in terms of pay and rewards, then one needs to look at the broader labour market. I think the real challenge is to make sure that we can provide appropriate reward for civil servants at every stage in their career, and also ensure, as we discussed in the past, that people can be promoted in post so that expertise stays where it's best capable of being deployed, but also that we ensure that the overall working environment in the civil service is better. That touches on some of the points that we were discussing earlier to do with the general respect given to colleagues in a working environment, but it also touches on some very basic bread and butter issues, like making sure that people have the chance to get rid of legacy IT that doesn't work, and that they have up-to-date IT, which makes sure that they can do an effective job in an efficient way.
Okay. Lloyd, I think you have question 15, which is the next question. So I was going to suggest that you asked question 15 and 17, and the chair, when he returns, can ask question 16. Exactly. I think that's what the plan was. Look, I just want to come in on the churn issue before I get to 15. I mean, churn has increased by 9%. In the civil service. Are you really saying that it's because IT wasn't updated and the general job market has increased churn? Is that the real reasons that it is increased by 9%? Because it would seem to me more likely that pay has been frozen and there's been a real pay cut by £2,000 in that period. That is. Has there been any research on the analysis of why people are leaving in larger numbers?
Well, it is, like so many phenomena, multifactorial. I think that you probably wouldn't be surprised how often problems with the IT, which colleagues have to work, is raised as a frustration. But I don't think it's a reason why people will. With
IT have been over many governments, and
you're telling me
gets IT right, do they?
Yes. But no, I think there are many reasons, and I suppose the point I was making to David is that we're entering tough economic times, and I don't want to make sort of any generalizations, but I think that it's particularly tough for many in the private sector. So if we're looking at pay overall in terms of recruitment and retention, I think we need to look at the broader economic picture. But prior, of course, to COVID, you're quite right to say that there was a level of churn, and I'm very, very interested in the reasons why people have left the civil service and also why people have moved from the civil service. And we're doing our very best to ascertain what those reasons are in order to make sure that we can continue to retain many brilliant people and also attract good people as well.
Exactly. I mean, and pay will be one of those factors. I mean, 1 in 5 at HMRC are paid at the minimum wage, so you can't get lower paid in the private sector than 1 in 5 of our colleagues. This is the agency that is included in enforcing the minimum wage, and the people are being paid it themselves, so they see the real impact of it. I want to move on to civil service reform. In September, you told us that civil service reform, a change in something, and change in how the civil service work is something you want to do with the civil service and not to the civil service. So 2 points on that. The first one, I wonder if you can answer, has that been made harder since the Prime Minister has dismissed the findings around bullying and behaviour by ministers?
I haven't observed the work that I do with civil servants and the work that we're doing to improve how all of government operates being affected by that at all.
Okay. So there's been no morale change, despite resignations, there's been no overall morale change on that issue?
Not in any of the working relationships that I've borne witness to.
And again, has the Cabinet Office sought to ask staff about that?
Well, we certainly survey staff regularly across departments and across government on their feelings about how effectively the departments operate and how well managed and led they are. And I take very seriously any concerns that are raised. I want to make sure that everyone who works in public service recognises that we value the extra mile that they go to for our fellow citizens. You know, the lecture I gave, which was called The Privilege of Public Service, you know, all sorts of things that can be picked apart, but my central argument was that there is an extra level of dignity and respect due to those who dedicate their life to public service, not just civil servants, of course, but, you know, people at the front line in the NHS and in the blue light services and so on.
I mean, if we're going to talk about dignity and respect and pay, of course, for civil servants, and your commitment to really reform the civil service to make it more efficient, which I think we all welcome, is there not a case to end this farcical situation whereby there are 200 separate bargaining units resulting in anomalous and inconsistent rates of pay, terms and conditions, management structures, even complaint structures in each different department, and return to a system of national collective bargaining or a nationally set wages within certain parameters, and therefore to mean that departments can focus on what they're meant to be doing and not on HR negotiations every 5 minutes?
I think you make a very, very good point. I think it is the case that trying to tackle some of the balkanisation of the process of pay, reward, recruitment and so on, creating what's been called in a vogue phrase, one civil service, I think it's a very, very good thing. I think we also have to recognise that one will naturally want to pay more for certain roles in certain locations. So, you know, exactly. In which case we're not arguing at all, we're agreeing.
But we have a kind of national pay structure for teachers and for other kind of professions, and so we should be able to try and manage to do so. And I think the union's very keen and on board with that, and I hope discussions are progressing rather than being said. Now, finally, you're one of the loudest critics, but also champions of the civil service in government. What do you think the impact of Dominic Cummings in terms of the government civil service reform agenda had? Did it kind of make civil servants feel that they wanted to engage with you on that reform agenda, or did it make them not?
Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I think the case was best made by Sir Mark Sedwill when he appeared in front of the committee. And Sir Mark said that, well, he wouldn't necessarily have expressed himself quite in the way that Dominic had, that many of Dominic's commentaries about how government overall could improve were ones with which he had more than a measure of sympathy. And I think it's also fair to say that while Dominic was critical of how government operated, he saved his strongest criticisms for politicians, not for civil servants. And as you know, having worked alongside Dominic in the Department for Education, while he's not everyone's cup of tea, it was the case that I saw that he had a very good relationship with lots of civil servants, which reflected their shared sense of mission. So, as I say, not everyone will necessarily have approved of everything that he said, but anyway, I'm a fan.
You're a fan of some of the stuff that he said around the civil service. Do you not think?
I'm a fan of Dominic overall. Again, one of the things is that I've had one or two disagreements with him over the years, but an awful lot of nonsense has been written about him, and I like him and I like his candour.
Look, I think that's a useful thing to say. I wonder how that will reflect on colleagues who find his candour difficult. And sometimes we have to moderate how we talk to each other, even if that's what we to reflect their sensibilities as well, if that makes sense. And I think
it makes perfect sense. I think that's very fair.
Yeah. Look,
I'm in committee at the moment.
Yes, we are in committee. David Mandel, I wonder, back to you, shall I do, the chair was meant to do 16. Do you want me to?
I think you should ask question 16, Lloyd, because it looks as if there's 3 votes and so the chair may not return imminently. And Mr. Gove referenced the item in that question, so you could follow through, and then I'll proceed with the set of questions that myself and Ronnie were due to ask.
Perfect. So sorry about that, Michael. I didn't want to pinch William's question if he was going to come back. Look, the question that the chairperson was going to ask was, in September you told us that you've been working to plan to flesh out the bones of your lecture that you mentioned. When will we be able to see that?
We're doing bit by bit. We'll be saying much more about our proposals for improving the training and education of both new arrivals and also the provision of additional skills for existing civil servants in the course of the next couple of months. And we'll also be saying more about places for growth, which is the sort of catch-all name that we've given to the relocation of significant roles and parts of government outside London. And we're also, I hope, going to be publishing a short but helpful overview paper in the new year.
Has Lord Maud completed his review?
Yes, he has. And what we want to do is to publish Lord Maud's work alongside Doug Gurr's work that I referenced earlier. But one of the things we want to do is to do that at a point when we can explain exactly which bits of it we're accepting and which bits we're not. I mean, it was originally commissioned, you know, as a what's the word? As a report for ministers. But we think it would be helpful to publish it, and then, as I say, to provide a sort of gloss on why we agree with bits of it, but well, almost all of it actually, but why there are 1 or 2 other areas where we won't be carrying forward as recommendations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Gove.
Thank you. Mr. Gove, you've argued that there's a deep sense of disenchantment on the part of many of our citizens with the political system that they feel has failed them. How do you see the government addressing that? It's
a massive issue. And I think that there are lots of different ways in which we need to address it. So the first thing, of course, is making sure that we deliver public services effectively. So it's the bread and butter task that all of us in government have of making sure that the operation of the NHS, schools, and so on improves. The second thing I would say is that we need to make sure that people have a sense that the services that government provides more broadly are easily accessible, well integrated, and as responsive as any other service with which the public interact. I think the third thing also, and it's a broader thing, is recognizing that there are some particular challenges that we're facing, as all governments in developed nations are facing at the moment, that sharpen some of the divides in our society. So COVID has been an uncomfortable reminder of some inequalities in our society, but it's also the case that some of the technological changes that will affect the world of work will sharpen some divides in our society, and government needs to show that it recognises how those potentially wrenching technological changes will affect the lives of many people. The other thing, again, without wanting to stay to go on forever, is that what we've thought of as globalisation over the course of the last 2 decades has increased prosperity overall. But it has also meant that some of the overlooked families and undervalued communities of our country have felt left behind with good reason. And that's why the government's agenda of levelling up is so important. There's a great book, I haven't read it all yet, I've just read a bit of it, by David Goodhart called Head, Heart, Hand, just out. It makes the point that you know, over the course of the last few years, there have been many people in this country who felt that decisions have been taken in the interests of the already well-off and well-connected, and that we need to do more to reconnect with everyone. Final thing I would say is I was watching, perhaps I shouldn't have been, an interview with Tony Benn from the 1975 EU referendum. And Tony Benn made this very important point. He said, you know, the most important thing is the vote. There are people who will have wealth and connections, who will be able to influence government, but the one thing that everyone has is the vote as a way of making sure that government responds. And I think that quintessential argument about democratic accountability, which we touched on earlier, is really important. So it's making clear that people's votes do determine the shape and the future of this country.
And do those answers imply, though, that you think that the current constitutional arrangements in the UK are fit for purpose and they are not a major part of the disenchantment?
Well, I think we do need to look at every part of our constitution to make sure that it is fit for purpose as well. It won't surprise you, or indeed Ronnie, to know that I'm a strong supporter of the principle that the different parts of the United Kingdom are stronger together. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at how every part of our constitution works in order to make sure that it's as responsive as possible.
The government had committed to launching a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission in the first year of government. I mean, obviously, a lot of other things have happened in that year, unanticipated. At what stage are the government's proposals for the commission?
We're eating the elephant in chunks. So it is the case that we've put forward some proposals for looking at how judicial review operates. We're going to be saying more. I think the Lord Chancellor has said a bit about how we can make sure that the Human Rights Act works even more effectively. And I hope that either I or the Prime Minister will be saying a wee bit more early in the new year about some other ways in which we can modernise the Constitution.
But are we likely to hear from either you or the Prime Minister or others that a commission is being set up and what its scope is going to be?
What I think we will see are different bits of activity, all of which come together. And so, as I say, it will be bit by bit by bit that we'll attempt to tackle all of these issues for reasons that I think most people will completely understand. The constitution, the system of government in this country depends on lots of different component parts, and it requires some thoughtful specialist care in each of those. So there are people who are, for example, very expert in helping us to refine how judicial review works, but there are also going to be people who, when it comes to looking at the relationship between central and local government, who will have expertise to bring to bear there. I think some people thought or interpreted the ideas as sort of new royal commission with 8 to 12 wise men and women looking at all of these issues. In fact, it's going to be a sort of a set of specialist groups looking at each part of it coming together.
Yes, I think the Lord Chancellor described it as a royal variety performance in his evidence to us. But just to confirm, because I think you have said it, but so we should not anticipate an all-encompassing commission.
It's not easy. Exactly, it's not the intention to have a sort of Kilbrandon 2 or something like that. It is the intent to have, exactly as the Lord Chancellor put it better than I did, a set of different talents coming together, looking at different parts of the whole picture.
Now,
sorry, carry on.
No, you carry on. We're here to hear you.
No. I was just going to say, I have another meeting afterwards, which is why we had to constrain time. But because of the voting and because it's disrupted things, I think I may get a kick under the table, but I think we can extend for another 10 minutes. In fairness, if you'd like to run until 3:10, I think we can do that.
Well, on behalf of the chair, I shall accept that offer and press ahead with the next issue, which relates to the commitments that you've given when I previously asked you about the publication of the Dunlop review, and you said that it would be before the internal market bill received royal assent. Obviously, that bill is ongoing at the moment. Do you have a clearer idea now of a publication date?
What I'd like to do is to publish it alongside the conclusion of the Intergovernmental review. As you'll know, David, and I think most people on the committee will know, for some time we've been looking, and this is part of the broader sort of constitutional renovation work, at how we can improve the way in which the UK government works with all the administrations in the UK. We've made good progress there, and part of what Lord Dunlop was arguing for was a systematic overhaul of how we did that. What I'd really like to do is to publish Andrew's report alongside the conclusion of our work there, but that depends on me being able to reassure the governments and the devolved administrations that we've got a seaworthy set of arrangements. But one of the things that we can reflect on is whether or not it's better, if we can't get that perfect agreement before the end of the year, to publish Andrew's report to explain what we've done so far, and also to explain the ongoing work that we're undertaking in order to complete and finish all of his recommendations.
Well, obviously only speaking for myself, but I mean, I think the scenario you set out is the optimum one of publicising his report along with the IGR. But if you are not able to do that, then I think it would be very helpful that you were able to publish his report before the end of the year, so that it can be looked at in a reflective way before, for example, within the Scottish scenario, and indeed the Welsh scenario as well, that we end up in an electoral mode, which may not allow for the sort of reflection that's required.
I completely understood.
You've also, so I think that has concluded the issues I wanted to raise. I think the chairman maybe had said at the start, but I wanted to be clear that there is a proposal that once the Dunlop report had been published, and indeed the Intergovernmental review, if that is possible, that this committee, the Scottish Affairs Committee, Welsh Affairs Committee and the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee would come together in some form, and would hope that you would be able to appear before that joint committee to discuss the issues raised.
The more that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and Westminster work closely together, the happier I am.
Indeed, and me too. But here is someone who may not be so happy in that regard, but will, I'm sure, ask constructively the questions that have been assigned to him.
Probably the worst introduction ever. But I do have a serious question in this, because the Dunlop review has been sitting locked away somewhere for some considerable time. I know members of this committee are allowed to go and read it if they wish to do so. Obviously, they can't write things down, they can't take photographs, the usual caveats. Well, I'm up here in Scotland, I can't travel to London, I can't travel to my constituency right now, so I can't get access to that report. Fortunately, I've got members of this committee who can do this. I'd like to do it myself. But as far as I know, the Scottish Affairs Select Committee don't have access to the Dunlop review either. Is that a situation? And if so, can you justify that?
Well, my understanding is that we are giving Select Committee chairs an opportunity to read the report. I think that's the case. If it's the case that there's any Select Committee chair who hasn't had that chance, then I'll get back to you.
You'll get back. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. The thing I would say is that it's not the case that the Dunlop report is like the second Mrs. Rochester or second whatever. Anyway, it's not being kept in the attic because we're embarrassed by it. It's a great report, but what we wanted to do, and I hope I mentioned this in reflection with David, is that we want to, as well as the recipe, we want to have the cake alongside.
Well,
so,
enough.
We want in proper Nigella fashion to show that we've baked the cake that we've been asked to.
Right now we're starving. Right now we're starving. So I don't want the icing. I don't want the cherry and top. I just want the cake, if that's at all possible.
Well, I'm absolutely, and Ronnie, there's nothing I would like more than to make sure that we can share a Christmas cake together.
if you can make it available to the chair of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, that would be great. But also, if you can maybe take into consideration the fact that if it's physically locked away somewhere in London, there are people who should be getting access to it who currently cannot get access to it.
Understood.
Anyway, we'll move on. Will the government proceed with the UK Internal Market Bill if legislative consent is withheld by devolved legislators?
We want legislative consent, but there are exceptional circumstances here. So yes.
So you will move on regardless. You'll disregard the fact that Scottish or the devolved parliaments will not give you consent, and you'll carry on regardless.
Not at all. Regardless, I've got a great regard for the views of the Scottish
Disregardless.
government. No. The thing is, you can have enormous regard, which I do, for the views of the Scottish government, but respectfully disagree. And one of the points about the principle we have here is that we don't normally legislate without legislative consent motions, of course, and we work hard in order to secure them. And I'm grateful to our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament who work hard to frame them. But there are certain exceptional circumstances, and leaving the European Union is one such, when we may need to legislate without necessarily having an LCM. But there's been very good working with colleagues in the devolved administrations, particularly but not exclusively the Welsh Government, in order to ensure that concerns and hopes that have been expressed about the UK Internal Market Bill can be incorporated into the finished product.
So if you've consulted, you're ultimately going to say, we're going to disregard your views on this. Where does that leave the Sewell Convention?
Well, the whole point about the Sewell Convention is A, it's a convention, and B, it says that the UK government won't normally legislate without LCM. That it doesn't say the UK government should never legislate without an LCM. The whole point about the Sewell Convention is that sometimes it envisages circumstances in which the UK government will inevitably legislate without an LCM, but that should be by exception.
So, I mean, you absolutely nailed it. The word normally is the key to that entire convention. The fact it's a convention is not what the paper is written on. This is another example of when we've tried to, or at one level, we've listened to devolved powers, and ultimately the UK Parliament is going to reign supreme, regardless.
Well, the thing is that normal means customary or usual. It doesn't mean at all times. Normally, Aberdeen could be expected to beat Kilmarnock, St Mirren or St Johnstone. They don't always. So the point I'm making is that there are, and this is clear in the convention, always circumstances in which it is envisaged that we will regrettably have to legislate without an LCM, but we'd always prefer to have one, and that is the purpose of the Sewell Convention.
So the purpose of the Sewell Convention is what?
That to recognise that there will be exceptional circumstances where we may legislate without an LCM. As I say, not normally means there will be times. So, you know, there will be occasions. If the Sewell Convention said the UK government can never legislate without an LCM, then it would be a different convention.
But these are extraordinary times, and I don't have to remind you.
You're making my point for me.
I'm just going to finish. These are extraordinary times because the people of Scotland voted to remain in the EU. So surely their voice has to be listened to.
Well, where to begin? The people of Scotland also voted to remain in the United Kingdom.
We're not discussing that now. We're talking about you've got an MCM motion here, which you're going to won't wait for. You've talked to devolved powers. The devolved powers in Scotland represent the voice of the people of Scotland. The people of Scotland said we want to remain in the EU. Therefore, you would expect the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, to express concerns over that and want to be part of that discussion, but also to have a say in the outcome. And what you're saying is you don't have a say in the outcome.
Oh, yes, absolutely. The Scottish Government does have a say in the outcome through the JMCEN and a number of other fora. And indeed, Scottish electors have a say in the outcome because they send superb members of Parliament, such as yourself, to Westminster. The point I would make is that one can't pick and choose referenda results. The people of Scotland had a referendum in which they voted to stay in the United Kingdom.
This is about
legislative. But the people of the United Kingdom had a referendum in which they voted to leave the European Union.
And encapsulated in that, what you were saying is that the majority of the population, 62% of the population of Scotland who voted to remain, that gets superseded by a majority of people in England saying otherwise.
No, I say that we operate as one United Kingdom. The point I would also make is that I think it is the case that between a third and 40% of SNP voters voted to leave the European Union.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Well, I think it is the case on the basis of looking at where votes were cast. But let's say it's only 20%. Let's assume that for a moment.
You're still making up a number.
I'll develop my point. How many? Okay, 20% of SNP voters voted to leave the European Union. How many SNP MPs in Westminster reflect that view? How many SNP MSPs reflect that view? The Admirable Alec Neil reflects that view, great man that he is. There aren't others. If we're talking about effective representation, then what about all those SNP voters who voted to leave? Who is speaking for them beyond Alec Neil and I think Jim Sillars? So if we're going to talk about percentages, then that seems to me to be a legitimate question as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gove, and thank you to my colleagues for so ably stepping into the breach as I voted on the bill I think that you've just been discussing, because I'm not proxy and act as proxy for two colleagues as well. Thank you all. If I could also just drawing things to a close in the context of English devolution, Mr. Gove. Now, the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government is currently, apparently, drawing up a white paper on English devolution. And given the constitutional nature of devolution reform and your responsibility for those issues and indeed strengthening the union, what involvement have you and Cabinet Office had in drawing up that white paper?
The pen holder and the leader on this is, of course, the Secretary of State at MHCLG, but Rob Jenrick and I regularly about these issues, and there is a Cabinet subcommittee that deals explicitly with some of these devolution and constitutional issues, and Rob and also the Territorial Secretaries of State and I often discuss these issues.
And in your Ditchley lecture, you spoke of, quotes, allowing communities to take back more control of the policies that matter to them, and spoke quite admiringly of policy innovation that comes from governors in the United States. Is the government's ambition to devolve power to parts of England?
Yes.
What appetite is there for that?
In my case, a strong one, but I don't want to preempt the work that the Secretary of State at MHCLG will bring forward.
Is there an appetite within the Conservative Party?
I think there is, yes. Let me speak for my own local authority in Surrey. I know that we have an excellent leader, Tim Oliver, and I know that Tim has some very well worked out plans for making sure that at any appropriate local government reform that he can exercise a greater degree of responsiveness. But again, one of the whole points about the glory of England is that we have different strokes for different folks. The success of Ben Houchen and Andy Street shows that the right approach for both Tees Valley and for Deeside and the West Midlands can be a strong combined authority. But again, in other parts of the country, a different approach is appropriate.
And how would you describe the government's long-term vision for how such devolution should operate within the UK?
Organic.
Could you describe the organic qualities it would need to possess?
Again, I think it's one of the sort of basic, I think, Tory principles is that out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. And I think that we recognise that you need to have different approaches in different parts of the United Kingdom. That's the first thing. And also potentially different approaches within England, as I say, combined authority mayors are right in some circumstances. Some of those combined authorities will assume responsibilities that others won't. In some cases, you will have very effective unitary authorities, in other cases not. I think the appropriate thing is to recognise that what is right for London might be slightly different from what is right for Greater Manchester, and that will certainly be different for what is right for Devon or for Surrey.
Well, thank you. We'll conclude our meeting there, Mr. Gove. Thank you very much for your attendance this afternoon. We are looking forward to having you in the new year at greater length, because we feel deprived of you sometimes as a committee, and I know that you would wish to satisfy that urge we have to see you more. But in the meantime, can I wish you a Merry Christmas amongst everything else that you're involved with at the moment, and thank colleagues and the team here for facilitating the meeting. Order, order.